people's priorities. Thank you, Alexis. Always forget to do that.
I know, I do too, apparently.
We heard a lot about the priorities that came out of the surveys, but we sort of wanted to start by asking each of you what would be your priorities as framed by the question of what is the most important aspect of Barnstable to preserve, or what needs to be improved over coming decades. So we're going to have time to talk about lots of different things, or maybe just something that comes to mind. John, would you mind starting?
Sure. John Ale, our place is in Hyannisport, and I would say the thing I want to preserve the most is the natural environment. That's why we're at Cape Cod. And I think the issues we have to face are how we have an economy that supports a retirement, vacation home being a major part of what makes the economy work, but that's caused by nature, and that's why people come from outside, like we did, and why and how we make that sustainable for the people who live here.
Great, thanks. Avery, would you mind continuing?
Hi, I'm Avery Revere, and I am actually on the local comprehensive planning committee. So I can't really answer that question simply because I've been thinking about really the broader aspects of the town and not just my village, which is Barnstable Village. I will just add that I ran an organization called Friends of Barnstable Harbor for 8 years. So clearly the environmental stuff is the land use and all of that is super important to me. But I also grew up here. I went to high school here, and I feel like I have a connection to the community and the people, all of the people who live here, and the changing demographics here. And so that's why I wanted to be part of this. So I try to be the voice of things that aren't necessarily my own personal concerns, but are the concerns of a greater good.
Great, thanks. Bob and Alex, I guess together or separately.
Hi, Bob and Alex Frazee. We're living in Barnstable Village for the second time in our Barnstable career, and have lived in Centerville and Osterville and Marston's Mills over the last 50, 60 years. So kind of have a sense of the town. We've been involved in a number of not-for-profits in the town of Barnstable and still are, and have a sense of some of the missions that they embrace and where they go and how successful or not successful they've been. I feel personally, and Alex may disagree, that's fine, that the environmental issues that are predominant in the response to the LCP surveys are very appropriate, but that those interests are pretty well represented. And I would like to say, for me, for this purpose today, I'd like to speak to the possibility that in the next 10 years for this working plan, Barnstable can find better ways to integrate the usefulness and therefore the preservation of its historic resources so that they have a modern day current value and currency that isn't just about looking at them as a thing from the past, but has them occupied and useful, well-maintained and appreciated, instead of just being relics. And I think part of that's an educational mindset that we need to try and transform. But more importantly, I think developing some planning incentives that help historic building owners, whether they be commercial or private or nonprofits, be developed so they can find new uses for the buildings that don't destroy their historic character, but make them full players in each village's community, whether it's Hyannis or Barnstable or Osterville or any of them. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think it's, for historic buildings, the challenge of the day, because watching historical commission meetings, as I do frequently, their principal business these days and for some years has been handling demolition requests. And so many of them are partial demolition requests, which are modifications to old buildings. And I don't oppose demolitions or modifications as a pro forma thing, but I worry that people don't approach their historic structure from the outset as a thing that has the potential I was just describing earlier. And I would love to see some literature prepared, some incentives codified in the town codes, and through the planning board's activities and zoning board activities, and maybe through the historical commission as well, that would promote them.
Are you involved in the Historic Commission already?
I served on the commission in the 1980s and early 90s, and I keep threatening Alex that I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and do it again, and I haven't quite had the nerve to do it. And I will. I mean, I sit in on their meetings a lot.
Mhm.
They do a great job, in my opinion. And if any of them start to look like they're getting exhausted, maybe I'll try and help them more actively. But for the moment, I'd like to not have to go to a Zoom or an actual meeting every couple of Tuesdays or whatever it is, if I can avoid it. So I'm kind of working more from the sidelines on multiple fronts rather than principally committing myself on
Speaking
one.
of finding the balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Great, thanks.
Thank
Antonia,
I am Antonia Stevens. I'm the director of the Hyannis Public Library. And although I am a Yarmouth resident, I have spent the 21 years living on the Cape as a librarian of one form or another in all the Barnstable libraries. Also on the Marston's Mills Historical Society with Bob. So I do echo his sentiment. But for me, one of the biggest priorities is a lot of the social service situations, especially in Hyannis. We are very much a hotspot for all that kind of, the challenges that creates. Plus, I would kind of related to that, I would love to see better public transportation and more convenient public transportation for the families and people who need to get to services in the village centers, whether they be, immigrant families with one car or seniors, or I noticed that is on the 2010 comprehensive plan. And I feel like not a whole lot has improved in that area. So those are my concerns. I mean, I am also, having worked in Katuitt, very concerned, and having had the Horsley Witten group actually put a stormwater retention garden in the Katuitt Library's end of their parking lot. That whole water system is very important to me too. So all of these things are important, but I think as representing the downtown Hyannis area, I would throw in my hat for the social service networks.
great, thanks. Well, clearly you're all ready to go and talk about this vision, which is great. I'm going to share my screen and put up this slide. We covered everybody, right, Alexis?
Well, I just wasn't sure if Alex had anything that you wanted to add. I thought I saw a hand or something.
Excuse me. Go ahead, Alex.
That's okay. I just wanted to add that keeping the economy going while all of these other things happen is a priority for me. Providing work situations and trying to encourage that. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
So this is a summary of the key themes from the public engagement. And I guess a lot of the stuff that you've mentioned is here. I guess the question is, does the summary sound generally accurate? I guess we assume it's an accurate depiction of what that has been heard throughout all the different workshops, but I guess is anything missing from we do in terms of what you talked about? We have preserving historic structures and features.
How do you want us to, do you want us to raise our hands or just talk, or how do you want us to?
I think it's such a small group, we can just talk if you're inspired.
Well, some have already heard me talk about this, but these are, I feel like the themes from the survey and from the community engagement things aren't quite as well-rounded as we had hoped when we were reaching out. And to Antonia's point, I don't feel like they represent the social services part of things. I feel like those voices have just not been accessed through our survey or through other means. So anyway, that's my comment.
I would like to add that I think in the last few years in particular, the voices of people of color have been raised quite a lot. And I kind of feel like that needs to be in here somehow, kind of the DEI goals that the community has. These are kind of the themes are a little bit vague about who in particular we want to, be continuing to amplify. So maybe a little bit more specific in that area, if that makes any sense.
Right, and you're suggesting that can be sort of pulled out of other engagements that have been happening the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, things like create more year-round employment opportunities, especially in the blue economy. Things like creating more opportunities for underrepresented entrepreneurs and, things like that or local small businesses, things like that have really been on the forefront of Cape Cod issues recently. I guess these are just kind of a little vague. And I still want to put back in the transportation because I think that got removed. It was in the 2010 plan, but it's not here about public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And Tony, I think you're spot on that to make Barnstable town in particular a sustainable place, whether you're in a retiree situation like I am, or you're a permanent employee, or your children are growing up here. We need to have all of that infrastructure, all of those systems working. The question that always comes up is what is the focus of the economy? Once in a while, I'll see something come up that, let's create a mini, Route 128 environment here. And I think that's wonderful if that happens. I don't know that it will, but I think why most people choose to live on the Cape as opposed to suburban Boston is they don't want to live in a very urban area. And we do have pockets that need to be denser. We have to do that to satisfy our community, to satisfy a lot of the needs of our community, but we don't have to go overboard on that either. And I think looking at balancing those things, and I'll just throw in my 2 cents on something, having whether it's the town government or the Cape-wide government be more proactive on where we do things. Not just, we talk, a lot of people talk about housing right now and how we have to fill housing needs. Absolutely, that's the case. But where? It's more the town reacting to some developer proposes to do something someplace, and we're going to follow that person, as opposed to let's have a concentration of housing or mixed use or whatever, whether it's along 132 or 28 or someplace brand new, in the middle of Osterville or wherever. Who is proactively looking at that as opposed to reacting?
Thanks. That's a great point, John. I just want to, Peter, if you don't mind, go back to the point Avery and Antonia both made about, kind of underrepresented groups. Is it your sense then that some issues have not been identified through the community engagement yet, or are you saying that those groups have not been consulted, or both?
I don't actually know,
Okay.
because I don't know whether I don't know what all the answers were. I mean, these are themes, so were there more specific things in the individual reports?
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I can answer.
Just looking at the group that was on the group of 40, I still don't think there was a person of color on.
Bingo.
just in looking at the faces I saw.
Okay.
And, here I am, a 60-something-year-old white guy dictating. I shouldn't be dictating. I'm just one person.
We have the for example, from the survey, the results in terms of gender. Hold on, education. 35% were graduate or professional degree, 30% are bachelor's. I mean, it sort of gives you a little bit of the lay of the land through that. There's also, if I dig through, there's age. Everybody was, well, our age is, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, as John just said. One of the things, I can't help but throw this out here, because in preparing for the meeting we had last week as a committee, I was thinking about a vision statement, and I was thinking about Carly just a few minutes ago gave the different systems. She called them the natural systems, the built systems, and the community systems. And I've thought a bunch about those, and I think of the community systems as the people and the natural systems as the land, and that basically the built systems are in service to those two other entities. I call the people the stakeholders, i.e. the community systems are the stakeholders, as is the land. I mean, everybody on Cape Cod is really concerned about the environment, as well we need to be. And the balance between those two is what the built systems are meant to accommodate and work in service to. That's the way I have simplified it.
Yeah, I like that.
I like that too. I think that helps people appreciate that tripartite separation of ingredients really well and in a more meaningful way.
Right, right.
I made just a note that I agree that transportation was missing from that last slide. And maybe it's just me, but it bothers me to always see historic resources connected with Cape Cod charm, which I think is a little bit cliched. And I want them to be taken more seriously than that. And I don't mean that shouldn't be enough, but I mean that I don't believe it is enough. And I think it's so clearly not enough that I would love to find some other terminology that we could find that's a little more sophisticated without being fancy and fluffy about it, but that allows people to engage preservation of historic and cultural resources in a manner that's a little bit more meaningful than just a Patty Page theme song or something like that.
What do you think people mean when they talk about Cape Cod charm?
Well, you're going to hear the word quaint awfully fast, which bothers me secondly as much as Cape Cod charm.
What do people mean when they say quaint?
Picturesque.
Nostalgia, old-timey.
Yes, I mean, all of those things, but none of them sound functionally useful in today's world other than how they make us feel when we see them. And they always take a second priority to the other more compelling things of finance and infrastructure and whatever. And I would love for them to be elevated to a point where they don't need to be just referred to in the old-fashioned way and can be more meaningfully an everyday item, the same as they were when they were new, because there's no reason they can't be.
Right. But we could say, I mean, quaintness and charm do exist.
Yes, they
They're
do.
worth protecting.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all. And for the people who, and there's many people who really maybe require those that terminology in order to know what we're really discussing, and I wouldn't throw it out. I would just say for that to be the principal element in the one-liner about historic buildings kind of caught me. And I just don't
It's
know if it can
also
be
a-
made better. That's all.
That's a great
Sustainable.
point. So it's about the utility of these resources as well.
Yes, it
and
is. So I think
sustaining them.
people tend to feel free to challenge their existence by virtue of thinking their utility is not equal to what it could be were they new buildings. And on the surface of it, it's probably true, but I don't think it has to remain true. And I think there can be more cost-effective ways to renovate them without destroying them that make them much more meaningful, thereby more functionally useful in today's world. And I think that's what we're missing. It always happens. I'm going to refer back to Sea Captain's Row in Hyannis as a very obvious example of how this transpired, where all the old National Register sea captains buildings were permitted to be demolished after some very careful consideration, and I get that. And I'm not even sure the decision was wrong, but I think it was right only because of the conditions in which it had to be made. And I think if there were better conditions set up for the historic buildings to have been considered in, they would have been considered more viably, seriously able to be retained and stay present.
Right. Again, that kind of more proactive instead of being reactive when.
Thank
Yeah.
you, ma'am. Yes. Yeah, I really do think so. I think if there were incentives in place up front, you're right, that would have helped a lot. Might not have saved them, but it would have changed the discussion a lot. And it would have made the example that I picked on a little more fun to talk about than,
Right.
well, sort of groan and get a big headache instantly when we think of that. And rightly so. It was a tough call.
Bob, another side of that same coin, I think, is scale.
Yes. Good call.
That the size of what we build, whether it's new, or the size of what we preserve, does it blend with the lifestyle choice that people make in choosing to move to or to remain on Cape Cod, as opposed to being in a Boston suburb or whatever?
Mhm.
Yeah, and there's a huge tendency for scale to be driven by high-end choices financially, and
Right.
you more often than not see an expansion of scale in revitalized neighborhoods, whether they be urban or rural, in most towns of America, not just here, but particularly in an area that draws people of some affluence to second home territory or summer recreation territory. It sort of invites that. And that becomes either very beneficial for us or a destructive one, depending on how it's handled, and it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
just
I'd like
want to, Peter, Steve and Marigold.
Yeah, I was just going to welcome Steve and Marigold. And
Excellent.
right now we're sort of talking about what the town's priorities should be over the coming decades, sort of based on some of the feedback which you heard about earlier. What do you think are sort of one or two top priorities for you is that the town really needs to be including in this vision for the future?
And we'd also love to hear if you're comfortable sharing, if you identify with living in a particular village, where you live, if in Barnstable.
Right.
Steve, do you want to start?
Sure. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. First, I apologize for joining late. I had something else come up. Anyway, let's see. We are recent residents, moved in a couple of years ago, and into Marston's Mills, and from Rhode Island, and we love it here. And so let's see. To me, I think when I answered some survey questions, I think it seemed like to me one of the biggest concerns is traffic. In the summer, congestion. But we're still learning about the area. So
Okay.
anyway, I'm not sure. Did I answer whatever the question was?
Well, I guess the question is, what do you think the priorities should be for the town moving forward? What needs to be protected, or what needs to be sort of fixed or enhanced in some way?
Yeah, and so I'm not sure that we've had enough time to actually, make an intelligent assessment, other than like what I said. I mean, it's clear that in the summer, the traffic is, really bad, but I'm not sure what can be done about that.
As a seasoned Cape Codder, what you learn is in the summer, you only make right turns.
Yeah. We've learned that, and we've discovered a lot of back roads that we probably would not have discovered if it weren't for the traffic. So, yeah.
Does anyone know what the summer population is of the town of Barnstable?
Ooh, good question.
I know that the recent survey came up with 50,000 or just under 50,000 for the town of Barnstable, but I'm pretty sure it's probably 10 times that much in the summer, if not more.
Yeah, I mean, if you fill all the Airbnbs and all the hotel rooms and all the back lots to put a tent up and visitors on a Saturday night and everything, you probably get a huge number.
But I think traffic and transportation they do converge, but they're different issues and concerns.
For sure.
Yeah.
Marigold?
So I have a couple of things that I just had reflect upon. My mother had lived here for 30 years, so I know the Cape fairly well. I was not full-time until about 4 years ago, but I had some background knowledge. And I've seen the Cape change over 30 years, quite a bit. And I'm certainly not a seasoned Cape Codder, come from someplace that was built later than all the roads and towns and villages here in Cape Cod. I think that's a big issue, that roads are so narrow. Where I feel comfortable is where there's sidewalks. We walk a lot, and there's just, I mean, it's a nightmare here to walk. And I see people, so we're in Osterville, and people drive over here and park specifically to walk in our neighborhood where there are no sidewalks. And the utility trucks and landscapers are still going 40 miles per hour. While now I notice that, they're driving while on their cell phones and while they're smoking pot in their cars, which just infuriates me because it makes everybody unsafe, especially in the summers where there's so many more people. And we walk with our dog. So anyway, the issues are that your roads don't have the capacity to add sidewalks. And certainly that would be a nightmare trying to get eminent domain from all the people to give up some of their yard space or what have you, to have people walk in front of their houses on a real sidewalk. So that's been a big issue for me, is just walkability. My husband uses the public transportation here all the time, and
that's
the
great.
buses are fairly good, but there's no bus stops. There's no place to stand in the snow or rain. Well, there's a few, but not very many. Thankfully, the buses will stop and pick you up anywhere and drop you anywhere, which is a real wonderful service, and it's very cheap. So that's been fun to kind of learn about. I think it could be improved, but the bus drivers are fabulous. The other situation that I have been concerned about for 30 years when we first moved here is like, oh my God, everything's on septic on a sandy soil. Jesus, what are they thinking? And I think originally it was like summer small cottages. Everybody goes away for 6 months or 8 months, comes back, uses it intensively, then goes away. Now we've got nothing but 20 bedrooms with 25 bathrooms, and people are much more here year round. So I've known that's a horrible environmental situation that's happening. And I know there's plans for some mitigation. I don't know if it's going to be fast enough to rescue all our ponds, but that I saw that on the list as a priority, water quality. It looked like it was one of the top ones, which is very, very important to keep tourism, to keep people coming back, to keep people wanting to have houses here, right? To own. That I think is one of the most important things, is to keep not necessarily the quaint charm. I think people want modern resources here. They want good healthcare. We've been here 4 years, still don't have a primary care physician, although we've tried and tried and tried. So I think I like the idea of keeping the old historic, what do you call it, charm, quaintness, integrity of the history here. I think that's very important. People come here to learn and enjoy the history, but it needs to have a little bit of a modern twist. And I see all these homes being built that are huge mansions that are modernized, but they do keep for the most part, well, no, that's not true, but some of them do keep the exterior looking somewhat the same. But I don't see that happening with our businesses. I see these horrible structures going up fast and sheet, and then a year or two later, they're vacant. They're not used anymore, and they sit there for years without anybody in it. And then people could talk about there's not enough housing, there's not enough, living space. And it's just this really strange juxtaposition of where we're putting our intention and our wealth, right? Where are all those tax dollars going from all those wealthy people, if not into our built community that's so important, I think, to keep people comfortable here and to keep the tourists coming. Otherwise, if we don't have tourists, the Cape will be, maybe it should go back to the quaint little villages where people are only here in the summer. But I don't think that's going to happen. So I think the historic integrity is really important. We've been enjoying the history, learning about the vast and deep history of Cape Cod. And that's another thing that's a little bit tricky to dig up. You have to really go look for it. It could be a little bit more prominent in the education and building that into what people can go look at and attract people here to see.
Thanks, Marigold. We're on a deadline here, so I want to share my screen again and see if we can sort of summarize the priorities that we've heard, and then move on. So this is sort of the priorities. Some of the priorities I've heard: sort of protecting the environment is the basis of sort of the economy and quality of life, enhancing social services, something about public transportation, and then really sort of taking advantage of historic resources, more than just like a vague idea of his, quaintness and charm, but really figuring out how to leverage that, and then focusing on an economy that serves people. And so one question is, does that sort of capture what we've been talking about in terms of what our priorities should be for the next decades? And then we also wanted to sort of look at this in a slightly different direction, which is what are the values that are underlying that? And to some extent, the priorities and values are very closely linked. For instance, if our priority is to enhance social services, what is the underlying value that we want to talk about? I think, Avery, you touched on this with the idea of, you put it very well. I wrote it down somewhere.
I think the built environment is serving the natural systems and the community systems. That's kind of the intent. Is that?
That's close, but go say community systems and natural. Do it in that order.
Community systems and natural.
We want, it sounds a little funny sometimes in a way, but we want people first.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, in the face of whatever, in the face of the kind of people that are listening to this.
And then Peter, instead of built environment, I would say built systems.
Yeah.
And I agree, people should come first in every single category we've talked about. There's no historic building worth fighting over if there aren't people who think it's worth fighting over. They have to have a reason. It isn't just because it's old. And that's true of an open field or shade trees or whatever you want to think of.
How do we express the value of maintaining historic resources?
I want to actually, I don't know about people come first. I meant in terms of the language, but I think what we really want is a balance between people and the system and the environment, because people should come first is all of a sudden, like, it sounds to me like, we're staking our claim on the land and we own it. It's not. It's just that it's very easy on Cape Cod for people to talk about environment. It's a lot harder for people around here to talk about the people. And so it's almost semantics more than it is. So I would rather on the values say that the balance between people and the environment is just critical.
Yeah, that's true. The more our population swells, whether it's seasonally or permanently, it's clear that the need for increased infrastructure is at odds with some of our community character concerns, whether it's the open spaces that we enjoy, which have environmental value as well as aesthetic value and value for our drinking water. But it's also a case of all the other kinds of resources we think identify this space we live in. They are all challenged by the number of people who've discovered them, and it's tough. It's a balancing act, definitely, which is what Marigold is really getting at, and I agree with her completely.
It's about interconnectedness too, because balance can imply, total separate things that are just balance, but there's no space between environment and people. Like, we exist in the environment, so we can't separate them.
Definitely.
Peter, can we take out the people should come first in every category?
Yeah, I want to ask.
Sounded good at the time, but I get Avery's point is right.
And what's the appropriate value regarding the economy? Obviously, economic growth and job growth value is important.
An overarching thing here is that all of this needs to be sustainable on a long-term basis.
No.
And I don't know whether that's a value or that goes into priority, but you can't just make the short-term decision to do something to fix a problem in 2023 that's going to have ripple effects in 2043.
Mm-hmm.
You also need to have an economy that allows people to actually live here without
sustainable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Antonia, because I think one of the things that we don't currently have listed in priorities that did come up, there are two things, Peter, that I have. One is the connection with housing and the economy that I think was touched on a bit and goes along with what Antonia was saying. If people work here, people need to be able to live in the community. Correct me if I'm wrong, Antonia. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I just realized we didn't have the housing connection anywhere in here. And then the other thing, Peter, that I have that I think is missing from priorities is a couple group members mentioned the importance of making sure underrepresented voices are involved in the process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say this morning, I was talking with a gentleman who works in the schools, and he said, as you walk the halls, only about half of the people are speaking English. And for the future, that's going to become even more important, that the kids that are there are in part our future and need to be taken into account. I mean, especially when you said, Avery, the kinds of folks that are making these decisions at the moment, many of whom are white, elderly, or older, or whatever.
How do we express that as a value?
I don't know, but there's a big constituency out there that needs to be heard.
Planning needs to be inclusive of all communities.
All stakeholders need to be at the table.
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of ways of putting it. We're all trying to say the same thing.
And you've been trying, and it's hard to do.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
Of time and whatever.
I think another concern that could fit into this, but I'm not sure in which category of the priorities, is contemplating the small mom and pop traditional business setting versus the large corporate entity. I'm going to use the pejorative big box. I mean, the community of Barnstable has thrashed this around for decades, but it's still relevant when you talk about your planning document on a every decade basis. And I think preserving the smaller, fine-grained business activity level in some ways is critically important to many of the other things we've talked about, including preservation, but I'm not just going to stick to that. I think employment.
Does that capture it?
Yeah, I really do think so. I mean, as a friend of mine pointed out one day, you know, even franchises are typically locally owned. So they're small businesses, even if they have a
Mhm.
large multinational name on top. And that's a really good point. We shouldn't be ruling someone out or anything out just because it comes from a big source. It may still be a very small local thing.
Mhm. You know, I don't know how we say this or what people think about it for that matter. I should ask that question first. But I think on the in Barnstable, we should not be for growth's sake.
Hmm.
In the sense that if you're, you know, a Sunbelt city or a large metro area, that yes, we need to have a sustainable economy and we need to look at ways of getting there. I don't know how to articulate it, but it's not the same approach as we want to grow just to have, you know, pound our chests and say we've increased our population by 10% or the number of jobs by 10% every 2 years or whatever. We value the closeness, scale. You know, we mentioned that in an architectural term, but I think it's also a community term.
Hmm.
But that needs to be sustainable and support the people living here. I don't know how to phrase that. But
I also want to add that I think a value is that we want to be a community that produces creators. We produce people who create and have talent rather than getting it from elsewhere. So we create an environment where people can be content creators and small business owners and get the skills that they need to produce things, not just be a place for people to retire to.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically including and welcoming and supporting young people and young families as a part of our sustainability is critical. And we haven't really been explicit in stating that in any of the things that I've seen today, not just our little breakout session, but even in the earlier stated goals. And we all know that the flight of young people over the bridge is just horrific.
Right.
And
I want to
sad thing.
I wanted to sort of, this is on the right side here, the 2010 vision that Dylan read. So sort of the last thing we want to do in the next 5 minutes is sort of, does this vision capture those priorities and values that we just identified? And
I think this is a really safe and not very visionary vision, to be quite honest.
Agreed.
There's no aspiration in that. It's sort of playing it safe.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think when we discussed this last week, we all kind of poo-pooed it as
It's a little flat.
And-
lacking spirit, if you will. Part of the same statement.
Peter, could you go back to the screen you were just creating, please? I just wanted to take a quick screenshot of it because we spent some time on it and I think some good points were made. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, well, if we're going to start over with the vision,
I think we do.
which of these,
In 3.5 minutes.
which of these priorities and values need to be part of that vision? All of them? Are there priorities among these priorities?
There are communities that have embedded the ideas of sustainability, which is a whole other issue that you'd have to actually specifically define, and resilience into every single decision they make. So that's sort of their overarching priority and value. And then that infuses all the other decisions they make. And that might be something to think about, maybe rephrase in different ways, maybe not just sustainability, because that's such a broad kind of intangible term.
Yeah, I think to some extent, sustainability was one of the themes of the 2010 plan.
Yeah. Not in the 2010 plan, and I don't know that there's anything in the beginnings of this one yet either, is accommodating climate change and sea level rise, which is talk about something that's going to put pressure on our built environment and our infrastructure and our social structure. These are huge and somewhat unknowable, but terms of unknowable in degree, but predictable in direction.
Mhm. Marigold, I appreciate what you said about needing to define sustainability, because I think when people hear that word, it very quickly, people have their own concept of what that means. But sustainability as an idea was raised in relation to multiple concepts in this conversation: sustainability of the economy, of
Yep.
the population by having, younger families and whatnot. So I think if that is encompassed somehow in a vision, making sure it's defined as to how it touches the systems in a broad way.
Right, and communities haven't just used sort of general terms like a touchstone or an idea or should infuse, but much more substantial. Like we
Hmm.
can't do something unless it meets these qualities or these values. And sure, it makes things much harder. It sometimes makes things more expensive. It makes things more time consuming, but often it results in a much more long-term broader success for any project. And it generates more community buy-in if more community stakeholders are involved in defining whatever sustainability or what you want to use. So it's not just infusing it with it or touching on it, but it's actually saying you must incorporate tangibly into every project.
Clock's ticking on us here.
Yeah, I apologize. We're running out of time, but we are going to have a chance to continue this discussion as a group. And then going forward. And there is another opportunity on tomorrow to come in person to continue the discussion if you're really warmed up and ready to go. I think it's still
I
be
wanted to, but I got stuck by snow up in Canada, so I was
Oh,
gonna
my.
go
Oh, no
tomorrow. So
kidding.
I'm zooming from my parents' house.
For
Can I ask
you.
one quick question? Is there anything about Native populations infused into Barnstable's visions or priorities?
I don't know of anything explicit, which is.
We
maybe-
talk about underrepresented communities here.
Right.
I guess I guess I
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody.
Thank
Our group was a sprint to the end and somebody got cut off, which I always feel bad about in these Zoom meetings. So sorry about that, Raquel. So what we're going to do now is share some of what we all talked about in our groups and see how much commonality or difference there is amongst them. Are any of the facilitators feeling like well prepared to do a report out right now?
I am, Dylan, because
Excellent.
we wrote it down on the slides.
Excellent.
If you don't mind me.
Could you fix the Zoom so that we can see everybody who's here? I'd love to be able to see everybody. who's
Yeah, so
here.
if you go and that's controlled on your end. If you go in the upper right corner of your screen, at least on my screen.
Oh, okay. Now it just appeared. It wasn't there. Okay, thank you.
So this is group number 2. We sort of had really good discussion and then tried to list the priorities. And of course, when you list them, you lose a lot of the nuance that people talk about. So we have more in the notes, but obviously a lot of these reflect what we've been talked about, but really with a focus on people as the sort of purpose of the planning process. And so whether it's protecting the environment as the basis of an economy and quality of life that serves the population, enhancing social services, we talked a lot about the need for that, and then public transportation as sort of being fundamental to quality of life for all different populations. And then an interesting conversation about the importance of really building on historic resources, and more than just talking about we need to protect our quaintness and charm of Cape Cod, but really trying to understand the utility of that and how, specifically those resources impact economy, quality of life, and so on, and really working intentionally to protect those resources. We talked about an economy that needs to serve the people in Barnstable, is particularly allowing people who work in that economy to be able to live there. That was so important. We wrote it twice. And then including underrepresented voices in the process, which we just sort of started talking about what that means in terms of people of color, indigenous populations, and so on. But obviously there's a lot to talk about there. And then we talked about sort of the values that underlie these priorities, which, as we discussed, is sort of the flip side of this is what we want to do, and the values sort of represent why we want to do it. So build systems serving the community systems and the natural systems. So really thinking about what kind of infrastructure we need, not just to make traffic flow better, but really to look at everything through the perspective of what enhances the life of the community and protects the environment. And to really focus again on the balance between people and the environment, to focus on the interconnectedness of people and the environment, not separate parts of this plan, but really integrated parts of it. Making decisions based on long-term sustainability, even though that adds a lot of complexity and cost, perhaps, to the planning process as well as the implementation. And then to include all communities in planning just as a value, that being fundamental to making a good plan and implementing a good plan. And then we talked about what flows from that is the value of focusing on small local businesses, encouraging young people and families, and local creators. And then we started to talk about a little bit what the focus of the vision is, and I think for most in our group, probably some combination of all of these things, but it was mentioned that sustainability really needs to be the touchstone for the plan. Even it was obviously written as part of the 2010 plan, but now is a good opportunity to look again as what does that mean in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment, in terms of the social structure and support systems in the community. And then obviously building resilience in the face of climate change has become much more important in the last 13 years. Does that capture everything from our group? I know it doesn't capture everything, but more or less.
Excellent job, Peter.
All right. Back to you, Dylan.
I think I'll go next. I didn't follow my own directions and write things down in the slide. So my report out's a little messier than that. So we had a very interesting conversation. I think in terms of the priorities that I heard, water quality came out very strongly as a priority. Protecting open space, preserving open space, protecting the environment in general also was mentioned. Somebody in the conversation said that basically the full left side of that slide that showed the key themes were really the most important things. And those were basically all about environmental protection, I think, as well as protection of existing character of villages. Another topic that we talked a lot about was housing, the need for housing for all types of people, basically. Housing for older adults, housing for young families, making sure that there's housing so that there are opportunities for people who work in the town to live in the town so that your economy can continue to survive and thrive. A priority that came up was the need to be a green community, by which I think people were meant, responding to climate change, mitigating climate change through things like green energy and recycling and solar panels and EV charging stations. So it's similar to the idea of sustainability that was in the last master plan, but I think getting more specific about what the town can be doing on an individual and on a community basis to sort of reduce your environmental footprint. And then we also talked about as a priority, the need for redevelopment versus development. So redeveloping existing built areas as opposed to developing in undeveloped areas. The values that seem to underlie those things were, care for the environment, care for other species, and so forth. Protection or maintenance of human health, providing opportunities for everybody, and then caring for other people, which came up towards the end of the conversation, particularly around the sense of a lack of safety in downtown Hyannis, and how that needed to be addressed to care for the people who are making other people feel safe, and also making sure that people can feel safe in downtown Hyannis. In terms of the vision, when we talked about the vision, we talked a lot about redevelopment versus development. And so there's strong support for preserving villages. And then the idea of redeveloping areas along your more major corridors, and specifically kind of transforming those into more walkable, mixed use, I suppose, village center like places. So somebody talked about having housing above stores, making it easier to walk around and so forth, and cited Mashpee Commons as a potential model for that. All right, that's my summary. I'm going to call on Carly.
Hi, Dylan. I'll do the report out. Carly did a
Okay.
great job facilitating our group. Okay, so for the community priorities and community values, some things that people just want to make sure was included, and I think they were, but I have under the, is anything missing? Climate change, human services, community character, and transportation infrastructure came to mind as things to make sure we're keeping in mind. Looking ahead for the coming decades, our group was interested in neighborhood life, residents living next to each other, and how that dynamic changes with Airbnbs and short-term rentals, which led to a conversation that was kind of woven throughout. Our discussion was feeling strongly that the vision should somehow help guide the town forward in a way that kind of is able to think through impacts of things that maybe aren't anticipated from past experiences, such as how the dynamic might change with a decision of short-term rentals or a new bridge or technology, how that affects different characteristics of the town. They also, a high priority is human services and taking care of the people that live in Barnstable. And then under the community vision, it was really interesting. I think one reaction was it's boring, and the other, and the same person, often the same people might have agreed with the other, is that it does describe the character of a community that is worth preserving. So maybe getting, just revamping it, getting more detailed, thinking through some of the major future changes and what the impacts to the town are, so the town can be ready to respond to the impacts. What has changed since 2010 that the new vision should address, and that's where technology came up. It also affects higher wage jobs in a good way, and the economy. So trying to think ahead toward what the next 10 or 20 years will bring and what different aspects of community that will affect. In terms of what the group would like Barnstable to be like in 10 or 20 years, for the environment, dealing with the effects of climate change are going to lead to some very difficult decisions about what to let go or what to reinforce, and the acknowledgement of the community needing to make some very difficult decisions came up under other topics as well, sort of a trade-off of priorities and different pressing issues. Also, it came in terms of development. There's not much land to build upon. Looking into redevelopment was expressed of interest. More access to transportation, more options on the Cape, easier access to Boston so people could still live in Barnstable but work elsewhere. Need to address human services. There was a desire to have some kind of school or college that would bring students to the Cape and allow them to live and work there after. Mixed income housing in not only Hyannis, but all the villages. Housing decisions on how the town moves forward and how villages are going to be effective with the need for more housing. And they wish the vision statement would say that the town, represents the people, and is enveloped around the interests of their, the residents. Principles or values that could be included in the vision: better overall urban design, street trees, planning for connection between residential areas, open space to downtown Hyannis. They thought Katuitt urban design was pretty good. What would the vision need to say to inspire you? So we kind of summarized, the synthesized, and said housing for all, planning for climate change, developing policies to guide urban design and connectivity, continuing to cultivate community character and preservation, consider the interrelated impacts of decisions, sustainable year-round education opportunities and economic growth. And the group really values their beautiful, wonderful community and their wish for that all citizens have sustainable and healthy lives. And that is all.
Thanks, Jill. Alexis, I have to keep it as brief as possible because we're getting close to the end of our time together. Oh,
Group.
Jeff's group, sorry.
All right, and I can be very quick and not to give short shrift to my group because we were awesome. We had great conversations and covered a lot of the things that have been mentioned already. So I will keep it very high level. One of the things we encouraged everyone to do was think of some keywords. So in terms of the top priorities, water quality, environmental resources, infrastructure, and that's both technological and hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, as well as the community character at each village level. Some of the key words that our group discussed was a future that is connected, sustainable, clean, balanced, preservation, stewardship, focus on future generations, and a plan that is proactive. And then lastly, I will also say some of the key themes that the group would like to see reflected in not only the vision, but the plan overall as a concept of balance, balancing resources, balancing the need to focus on villages as well as townwide direction. How do we prioritize all of these issues? Because they're all important and we want to do them all, but how do we prioritize? How do we involve performance metrics so that we know what we've achieved and what we've achieved success, and really continuing with this concept of transparency in government. And that is my 30-second spiel. Of course, there was a lot more discussed than that.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so I wanted to thank you all for coming today. The next step for this is we're going to have basically the same meeting over again tomorrow in person. So you all don't need to come to that, but you're welcome to if you want to do it all over again. And after that, we're going to basically summarize the input that we heard and bring that to the steering committee for this project. I see several of the members of that group here today, and go over it with them and start to flesh out what the vision should be. So we'll be primarily working with them to do that. So again, thank you for your time. And I see one person raise their hand. Ken, do you want to say something?
Listening to this, it's frightening. There is a gigantic bag of ideas, thoughts, missions, whatever. To me, a vision statement needs to be succinct. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be encouraging. And I just see what has been said has just been so much. It's impossible to cover it all, and everything will lead to something else worse happening. So I hate to be such a pessimist about this, but I've done this for too long. Sorry.
All right. Well, on that sad note.
Sorry.
Hopefully we can pull it all together and make it into something that's concise and inspiring and cogent. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Don't feel bad, Ken. I said it was superfluous, the vision statement.
Well, until we see people of color on this Zoom call or in the audience, I don't think anything will be really equitable.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all. See how it goes. Bye-bye.
Sorry.